wage wars of national defense. And these are wars in which the aggressing party, A, aims at acquiring control over what we might call purely political goods. Goods such as a certain territory or control over certain, a particular political community or the political institutions of the community. Now, to be sure, in wars of, cases in which A aims at acquiring control over these political goods, some of the members of the victim state might be killed, but they will be killed only if they resist, if they don't surrender this political good. And defending the permissibility of these wars, as David Roden famously has argued, and others have argued, is tricky on reductivist individualist grounds, because it looks as if purely political goods are not what are sometimes called vital interests. So vital interests are interests whose fulfillment is necessary in order to have a minimally decent life. And generally, we can use lethal defensive violence in order to protect vital interests, but not to protect lesser interests. And the idea that political self-determination or political participation is a lesser interest, is not a vital interest, is often illustrated by appealing to something like this example. Suppose you are driving to cast your vote in a general election, and I prevent you from reaching the ballot. Intuitively looks as if you are not permitted to kill me to exercise your right to political self-determination. But if that's the case, if that's the case, then it's not clear how a political community can kill in a defensive war others in order to guarantee to all its members the right to exercise their right to political participation. Now, of course, a way to justify wars of national defense is to give up either reductivism or give up individualism. So we could think that there are special moral principles that apply to war that do not also apply to interpersonal morality. So Seth suggests this possibility in one of his papers. Or we might believe that the value of a political community is not reducible to the contribution that it makes to the interest of its members. So Jeremy, for example, likes this strategy. Of course, Helen does not like either of these strategies. Helen is a hardcore reductivist individualist, and so in chapter 5 of her book, she argues against David Roden that it is permissible to justify waging wars of national defense on reductivist and individualist grounds. So in my paper, I criticize Helen's arguments, argue that she doesn't successfully meet Roden's challenge. And in the second part of the paper, I outline an alternative argument that aims to do just the same thing. So vindicate the permissibility of waging wars of national defense on reductivist and individualist grounds. So I start by looking at the two arguments that Helen offers to justify wars of national defense. The first argument consists of two claims, a normative claim and an empirical claim. The normative claim is that the distinction between vital and the lesser interest doesn't track the distinction between interests that we may defend by using lethal force and interests that we may not defend by using lethal force, but rather the distinction between interests that may be protected by lethal force when violated in isolation and interests that may be protected by lethal force only when they are violated on a large scale. And of course, in the case of wars of political aggression, or as they are sometimes called, case of bloodless invasion, the interests of multiple people are threatened. And so if Helen is right that these are interests that, if violated in isolation, do not justify using lethal defensive force, but they justify using lethal defensive force when they are violated on a large scale, now we know why it is permissible to wage a war of national defense, despite the fact that it's not permissible to kill the person who's preventing you to reach in the ballot. And I think there are a number of objections against these strategies. Others offer similar strategies. Tom Urka is one, Cecile is another one. There's Seth, again, discusses a number of these objections. I think the most important one that Seth raises is that it looks as if we take this view, then it looks as if whether a state has a right to defend itself, wage a war of national defense will depend on the population size, and this seems intuitively implausible. So the larger the population of V, the weightier the sum of their lesser interests at stake, and so the easier it is to justify wars of national defense. But intuitively, how big a state is seems to be irrelevant as to whether they can wage war of national defense. And both international law and ordinary and common sense morality don't seem to believe that whether such war can be waged will depend on the size of the population. So this would be a revisionary understanding of wars of national defense. Here's a second objection that I think can be raised against Helen's view. Well, intuitively, whether it is permissible to use lethal force to defend a particular interest will depend on the role that the interest plays in contributing to the well-being of the interest holder. But now, if the interest that A has in X doesn't contribute enough to A well-being, and the interest that B has in X doesn't contribute enough to B's well-being, and the interest that C has in X doesn't contribute enough to C's well-being, it's really hard to see how it is possible that the interest that A has in X, B has in X, C has in X contribute enough to the well-being of A, B, and C. This formulation seems equivalent. So it's not clear why, if we cannot use lethal force in this case, and in this case, and in this case, now it becomes permissible to use lethal force in a case in which we aggregate the interest of each members, because presumably the contribution that these will make to the well-being of this group will be a function of the contribution that each interest will make to the well-being of each member of the group. Okay, so here's a second argument that Helen offers. This is a non-aggregative argument. I think this argument is more plausible, but she presents this argument very quickly. So she says that certain arms, when they are aggregated, they produce a step change in what threatens each individual. So all the quotes in the slides are from Helen's book, of course. And so she has this case in which a government in Britain is elected only by Londoners but rules over the whole of UK. And she says that this is a more serious wrong than the wrong that is perpetrated against the person who cannot reach the ballot to vote in a general election. And I think that she's completely right about this. And I think this is the right way to think about this problem. However, she doesn't clearly articulate what the difference is between the two wrongs, the wrong of preventing someone from voting and the wrong of setting up a government or creating a political institutions that doesn't reflect all the members of the political community. More importantly, she doesn't tell us why it is permissible to use lethal force in the second case, but not in the first case. So I think the Roden and others might be happy to agree that these are two different wrongs, and then the second is more serious. But Helen still hasn't told us why it is permissible to use lethal force to prevent the second wrong. And I suspect that this is why she feels the need to invoke a further argument to support her conclusion. So she says that it is rarely the case that when A tries to annex V, A will not violate any of the rights of the members of V. So typically what will happen is that the members of the victim state will have to live in a state of oppression and fear because the aggressing state is prepared to put down dissenters and quash legitimate and reasonable dissent with violence. These are all quotes from chapter 5. But I think that this is not the right way to go. I think once we go down this way, we have given up the attempt to try and meet Rodin's challenge, because now it looks as if even if we can justify waging a war against the aggressing state, we are doing that by appealing to non-purely political goals. So I think there are problems with this strategy. First, it doesn't do the job that we were promised. Second, the view, I think, is implausible. It's implausible that there can be cases of bloodless invasions, because this further harm will typically follow. Again, Seth has a number of nice arguments against this claim. And it doesn't vindicate international law and ordinary morality, again, because we don't think that the permissibility of waging wars on national defense typically will depend on this further harm being on the horizon. So I think this is why we should not be satisfied with Helen's argument. So what I'll try to do now is to offer an alternative argument that does what that achieves the same goal that Helen is interested in pursuing in her book. So the argument I offer focuses on self-determination, on political self-determination. Now, when people discussing cases of wars of national defense typically discuss a number of very different political goods, almost as if they were interchangeable. They talk about territory, they talk about political values, they talk about political self-determination. I think this is a mistake because the interests that we have in these things are very different. So it's not clear that an argument that will justify waging wars on national defense in order to protect one of these interests will also work in order to protect other interests. So my argument focuses on political self-determination. It vindicates the permissibility of waging wars on national defense in order to protect territory or culture only insofar as doing so is instrumental in order to protect political self-determination. So I work with a fairly standard and I think not particularly controversial understanding of self-determination. So self-determination is, I think, a process through which an agent governs itself by autonomously choosing how to act. And in autonomously choosing how to act, the agent shapes its own identity as a result of the choices that the agent makes, so that the agent determines itself through the exercise of its own agency. I think that this understanding is fairly uncontroversial when we think about personal self-determination. So now the question is, how should we think about political self-determination? How can a political community do that? And I think there are at least three models that have been offered and can be used to articulate the ideal of political self-determination. So there is what I call the collective intentions model, and here the idea is that individual agents form some sort of collective intentions in deciding how to act as a group. These intentions don't have to be necessarily the sort of strong joint intentions that Ratman is talking about. That could be something weaker, for example, what Chris Kutz calls participatory intention, or something like that. Another way in which a community can exercise political self-determination is by delegating someone to act on behalf of the community. And a third way is by creating a sort of deliberative process that enables the agency of the different members of the community to be combined in such a way that the outcome can be said to be the expression of the agency of the group. And roughly this is what Christian List and Philip Pettit do. So I don't think we need to choose one of those models. I think actually political self-determination typically relies on all of them, perhaps other models as well. What I'm interested in is two features that all these models have in common. They all ground political self-determination in a particular type of relationship between individual agency and collective agency. So political self-determination is now grounded in a metaphysically suspicious collective entity. And the way in which collective agency is exercised according to all these models reflects the way in which the members of the group exercise their individual agency. So although none of the members of the group typically can make a difference as to how the group will act, there is a sense in which the way in which the group acts bears the mark of the agency of the members, is imbued with the agency of the members. Now, I call this the interactional account of political self-determination. I just want to flag very quickly that, so we can contrast the interactional account with other accounts, for example, Waltz's account, where the focus is very much on a political community being governed according to certain political values. I just want to flag the values play a role in this account as well, because typically how the members of a community will interact is shaped by certain values that the community is founded upon. So for example, egalitarian societies are more likely to rely on some form of democratic government than non-democratic societies. And of course, there are different ways in which the value of equality can be declined, and so there are different models of democracy that can be used. So this is just to flag that value can be part of this picture. Okay, so this is how I understand political self-determination. So now let's get to the tricky bit of the argument. How can we use lethal defensive force in order to protect political self-determination so understood? Well, start thinking about personal self-determination, right? So the capacity of individuals to autonomously choose how to shape their own life and pursue the choices that they make. So this is what we sometimes call personal autonomy. So for example, Russ says personal autonomy is an ideal of self-creation. I think he has in mind what I call personal self-determination. So I think we normally believe that personal self-determination is a constituent of a minimally decent life and thus constitutes a vital interest. And so we can use lethal defensive force in order to protect our personal self-determination. So Rodin himself acknowledges that, for example, it is permissible to use lethal defensive force in order to avoid enslavement. Now, of course, enslavement is a particularly egregious attack to our personal self-determination, but I believe that less serious attacks to our personal self-determination can also be defended by lethal force. So, for example, if I am about to hypnotize you or to coerce you in order to get you to... Sorry? To what? Okay. Okay. In order to know, I was expecting that sort of comment from Itzhak. So that's why I wasn't expecting it from you. Okay.
You're both
there you go. So if I am about to get you to spend the rest of the life with a partner that you haven't chosen for yourself, and the only way in which you can prevent that is to kill me in self-defense, I believe you may permissibly do so. Even if I am going to get you to live, to spend the rest of your life pursuing a career you haven't chosen for yourself, right? You want to be a Greenpeace activist, I get you to be the CEO of some corporation. I think if the only way to prevent that is to kill me, I think you're permitted to do that. So I think it's permissible to use opportunistic lethal force to prevent me from acting in this way, and I think it's also permissible to use non-opportunistic lethal force against innocent bystander to prevent that. Okay, so now think about the relationship between personal self-determination and political self-determination as I have presented it a moment ago. So we've seen that political self-determination is just an expression of personal self-determination. It's the expression of the personal self-determination of a group of people acting together. So when we say that a certain group is pursuing a particular goal, what we mean really is that the individuals forming the group are pursuing that goal. And ultimately, I think that respecting the agency of the group is valuable because it is a way of respecting the agency of the members of the group. So the idea is that there are issues with respect to which it matters to you that you decide autonomously how to act by deliberating as an individual. And there are issues with respect to which what matters to you is that you deliberate as a member of a group. And so for example, I think it matters to you that you get to choose how to raise your children together with your partner, for example. I don't think you have a right to decide how to raise your child by yourself. You have a right to, with some exceptions, of course, but you have a right to decide how to raise your child as a member of a couple. And if I prevent you from raising your child in the way you want, I'm wronging the couple. But what this means really is that I'm wronging you and that I'm wronging your partner. There's nothing else. So I think that if we make kill to stop interferences with valuable exercises of our agency with respect to choices that we make individually, I think this right extends to valuable exercises of our autonomous agency with respect to choices that we make as members of a collective. And this is because exercise of our personal self-determination as a member of a group are no less valuable than exercise of our personal self-determination as individuals. Now, this is not to say that we can always use lethal force to prevent others from interfering with our autonomous agency. So, for example, how formally I dress, a problem that we are struggling with at the Yale Club these days. How formally I dress is not a particularly important, is an expression of my autonomous agency, but is not a particularly important component of the plan of life I have autonomously chosen for myself.
Don't undersell yourself, Massimo.
Sorry? So Seth just recently told me that he thought he was part of my plan of life, and he realized that he wasn't, so probably you changed the way you look at me.
Yeah, once I saw other Italians and I saw that you were scrubbing.
That's right, yeah. That's right. So as it turns out, it is not a part of my plan of life, as Seth used to think. So if you force me to dress more or less formally, it doesn't seem to me that this is the sort of interference with my autonomous agency that warrants resorting to lethal violence. But there are other exercises of my autonomous agency, as we've seen, in which it is permissible to resort to lethal violence in order to protect my capacity to live the life I've chosen for myself. But now, even if you look at exercise of our autonomous agency that do fall within the sphere of conduct that is relevant, that is important for the plan of life we've chosen for ourselves, it's not true that any violation of my agency within the sphere of conduct also necessarily warrants resorting to lethal force. So, for example, spending time with my partner, with my family, is an important component of the plan of life I autonomously chose for myself. And so this is why if you were to stop me from spending a significant amount of time with them, or the rest of my life with them, I might be justified in using lethal force against you. But if you're trying to prevent me from spending this afternoon with them, obviously I may not kill you in order to prevent you from doing that. So it looks as if we need to look at two things in order to establish when we may resort to lethal force to protect valuable exercises of our self-determination. First, we need to look at how central the sphere of conduct that is affected by a given exercise of self-determination is to our capacity to live the life that we've chosen for ourselves. And second, we need to look at how seriously a particular attack will set back our capacity to exercise our self-determining agency within that sphere of conduct. And I think that once we think about this problem in this way, we can easily explain why we are not permitted to use lethal force against the person preventing us from voting, but it is permissible to use lethal force in order to defend the capacity of the political community to exercise its autonomous agency. So when you prevent me from voting, this has very little impact. In fact, it has no impact on the capacity of my political community to exercise its collective self-determination, and it has very little impact on my capacity to exercise my individual, my personal self-determination in the way required for me to count as a member of a political community. And this is because if you prevent me from voting, but enough members of my political community are allowed to vote, then the result of the election will truly reflect what the political community wants. And the fact that my vote hasn't contributed to that doesn't change that. And it's also true that I have an interest in being able to take part in the process of collective agency, to mix my agency with the agency of my fellow citizens in the way required for me to count as a member of a political community. But if you prevent me from voting, you are not really precluding you're not really preventing me from exercising my individual agency in that way, because voting is only one of the many ways in which I mix my agency with the agency of my fellow citizens. I can do other things. I can campaign. I can run for office. I can take part in a political discussion. So if you set back one of these two interests, then things are different. So I think if you prevent me from doing all these things, I think I'm permitted to use lethal force to stop your attack. And if you prevent enough members of my political community from interacting in the way required for the outcome of, say, of a general election to count as a reflection of what the political community truly wants, then I think in that case, lethal force can be used. And this, I think, explains the case of the Londoners that Helen discusses. It explains why we can use force in that case, but not in the voting case. So there will be, how am I doing with time?
You've had 25 minutes.
I have or spoken?
You have spoken for 25 minutes.
Oh, great. Good. So there are at least two objections that I think people might want to raise against this model. So one objection is that the model, let me check how much. Okay. One is that this model works, but it only works for small groups, such as the family or a couple. It doesn't really work for larger groups, such as a political community. And the reason why you might think that is because when it comes to small group, although I will not, when I exercise my individual agency, I will not always get the group to act in the way I want. There is a reasonable chance that how I exercise my agency will get the group to act in the way I want. So suppose, for example, that my wife and I are trying to decide whether we should send our children to a public school or to a private school. So we discuss it a lot, we take part in the sort of deliberation process that is required to, for the couple to figure out what they need to do in this case. In the end, my wife wins and we send the child to public school, and I wanted to send the child to private school. Well, in this case, how I exercised my agency did not make a difference to how the group eventually acted, but I could have. I mean, we can imagine other cases in which what will go my way. But this is never the case in the case when we consider a group as large as the state. Your vote will never make a difference. You know, the way in which you exercise your individual agency will never make a difference. So in reply to this objection, I just think that looking at whether the exercise of your individual agency makes that kind of difference is just not relevant in order to establish that there is the right sort of relationship between your agency and the agency of the group, so that the action of the group can be properly attributed to you, and you can see the agency of the group and think, yes, that's what we wanted to do as a group. So suppose, for example, that take the same case, right? So my wife wants to send our child to I don't remember, private school, and I want to send it to a public school. In the end, we decide to send our child to public school. But in fact, the option of sending our child to private school was never an option, because sending our child to private school was much more expensive than we thought it would be. So it was never, my wife never had the chance to get the group to act in the way in which she wanted. So this is sort of a Frankfurt-style case, right? It was never an option for her. And yet it seems to me that if her and I deliberate in the right way and we end up sending our child to public school, we can in a sense reflect ourselves with the outcome of the group. We can say, yes, this is the choice that we made, this is how we want to live our life, this choice can be properly attributed to us in the right way. It is an exercise of our self-determining agency. So the fact that she didn't have a chance to affect the behavior of the group, that she didn't have a chance to affect the behavior of the group doesn't seem to undermine the fact that she exercised their agency in such a way that how the group acts bears the mark of her agency. So another objection that can be raised against the model I offer is that, well, there simply is no value in membership in a political community. There's value in being a member of a family or a couple or the Yale Club, but there's no value in being a member of a political community. So I think, well, I want to say two things in reply here. So one thing is to say, look, the problem of wars on national defense, as it is discussed by Helen, by David, and by others, makes sense only, is interesting only if we are presupposing that there is some value in being a member of a political community. Because if there is no value, it is trivially true that we cannot permissibly kill in defense of membership in a political community. So the more radical view that there's just no value in being members of a political community is just not, a perspective within which it makes sense to even discuss these things. And the second thing I want to say is distinguish between two versions of this claim. So one is the claim that there's no value for, say, any citizens of a state in being a member of a particular political community that happens to be living on the territory of the state, or that there's no value for everyone. So I think that the stronger claim is false and should be bracketed for the reasons that I just mentioned. But I think it is true that not all the members of the citizens of V are members of these political communities. So I think that although we need not consent to be members of a political community, there is a voluntaristic dimension to membership in a political community. So you need to identify with your membership or endorse your membership or something like that. I defend this view elsewhere. But now, the fact that I adopt this view, I think, makes trouble for my account. It makes trouble for my account because if I ground V's right to wage a war of national defense in the interest that members of V have to protect V's capacity to act as a self-determining agent, now it looks as if this right cannot be grounded in the value that V has for those citizens of V who do not value membership in V, right? So think about someone who is a citizen of V, but he just doesn't care, would be as happy if he was a citizen of A. Surely this person has an interest in surrendering rather than in fighting in order to defend V's political self-determination. He doesn't care about V's self-determination. And I think that what we should say here is that that's just right. So I think the interest that the citizens of V who do not identify, do not fulfill the condition required to count as a member of V's self-determining community, their interest counts against waging wars of national defense. And I think then what we need to do is basically trade off between the interest that the members of V's self-determining political community have in protecting the capacity of their political community to exercise its political self-determination, and the interest that non-members of V's self-determining community have in minimizing risk to their own life, and so to surrender. And I think children raises interesting special problems, but in the interest of time, I will not discuss them here. So ultimately, there is a trade-off to do between the interest of those who identify as members of this political community and those who don't. Now you might think, well, now you're back to aggregation. So you have the same problem that you've raised against Helen's view. You have to aggregate this interest. But notice that I don't have exactly the same problem. I'm not subject, for example, to Seth's objection that now whether I have a right to, whether a particular state has a right to wage a defensive war will depend on the size of the population of that state. Because what matters is how many members of V identify with V's political community. It doesn't matter, V could be tiny. Insofar as a sufficiently large number of V's citizens do identify with V's political community, V will be justified in waging a war of national defense. So we don't have that problem there. So the case I want to consider to conclude this presentation is another case. Okay, just one last point. So this is a case in which A is interested purely in controlling V's territory. So suppose that A is not going to take control of these political institutions. A says, the parliament and the rest of your political institutions are going to function exactly in the same way in which they were functioning before, before we conquered you. We are just interested in the minerals. We are just interested in having control of your territory for these purposes. So self-determination, so the capacity of the members of it to self-govern is not at stake here. Now the question is whether we may wage a war of national defense in order to avoid what, this is Nick Southwood's idea. He calls this hands-off imperialism. And I guess the question is whether political self-determination is compatible with hands-off imperialism. So, and the reason why we might doubt this is because we might think that political self-determination is an example of what Petty calls modally robust values. So modally robust values are values whose instantiation depends on the fact, not only on how things are in the actual world, but also on how things are in a number of non-actual worlds, in a number of counterfactual scenarios. So for example, love is an example of a modally robust value. Whether you love someone doesn't depend just on the attitudes that you have toward this person, but on the attitudes that you would have toward this person in a number of non-actual scenarios. So if you were to stop having the attitudes toward your lover, if he were to lose his good looks, or if your mean friends were to make fun of his job or his accent, we would say that you are not really. We would say you're not really loving that person. And so we might think that self-determination requires the modally robust counterpart of what we might call self-governance. It requires what Southwood called self-rule. Now, I haven't thought, and I'll wrap it up, I haven't thought much about this, but what I'm inclined to say, and I'm curious to hear what you think, is that insofar as we understand self-determination in the way in which I have presented this so far, as grounded in the interest that we have in being the authors of our own life, then self-governance seems sufficient for that. We don't need the modally robust version of self-governance. And again, think of the case I mentioned earlier on, the case in which my wife and I are trying to decide whether we should send our kid to a public school or a private school. So suppose, again, we send it to a public school. But if we had tried to send it to a private school, you would have hacked into our bank account and taken away all our money so that we couldn't have afforded to send it to a private school. It seems to me that once again, insofar as we deliberate in the right way about it, we discuss it, in the end we decided to send our kid to a public school, that choice is again a genuine expression of our self-determination. This is again how we wanted to shape our life as a family by sending our child to a public school. So I don't think that our capacity to act as a self-determining group is undermined when we don't have modally robust self-governance. And I just want to say, so this is a reason why purely political aggression that leads to hands-off imperialism doesn't justify resorting to lethal violence, but it might well be the case that we cannot have self-governance unless we have control over at least some natural resources, or perhaps over some areas that are important for religious or cultural reasons. And in that case, I think lethal force in order to defend these parts of the territory would be permissible. I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
Just try to ignore this.
Yeah.
All right. What?
That's pretty dark.
What?
It's like a proof of life video. Okay, so Helen.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Massimo. So this is really, really good. So yeah, I mean, I like that. I mean, you know, it could be that the strategy that you propose is also another way to go. So I'm going to focus, I think, mostly on the problems that you raise for what I say. So I don't see the force of the population size objection. It just seems to me really plausible to think that. So firstly, I think that this is not a question it's unlikely ever to be a question of whether a state can wage war or not. It's likely to be a question about how much force the state can use in defence of its political rights. Because it's not as if just when we have a just cause, then you get to use as much force as you like, right? There's still a proportionality restriction on how much force you can use. And it just seems really plausible to me that the number of people whose rights are threatened affects how much harm is proportionate for you to do. And so I don't see the worry here that, look, it seems really implausible that as if every state should get to do the same amount of harm in defence of its political integrity. I think that's false, because I think what matters are the individual rights, and I think the number of rights being defended just affects proportionality. I think it's probably true that of any existing state, it has enough people that it could use at least some force, right? The question is simply how much force. And I don't see the worry that bigger states get to use more force because they've got more people whose rights are in danger, and so they get to do more harm, just as we do normally when we're defending against harm. So I don't see that problem. And then the second objection that we get here, I think you're right that I go too quickly, or obviously it's still the OUP page limitation thing that came up yesterday, but this thing about the
longer book.
In the longer book, this stuff about how we suddenly get a difference in kind once we start threatening sufficient number of people's political rights. So I think definitely, more needs to be said, and I like the way that you kind of thought, well, okay, maybe this is actually the more interesting thing. But I don't see that this, so it wasn't supposed to show in the book, that wasn't supposed to be the justification for using force. So one of your objections is, look, you haven't shown that this is what makes it permissible to use lethal force. It wasn't really meant to. It was supposed to really show that David is just moving too quickly when he thinks about what reductive individualism implies about political rights. So it's not like we just go from collective political determination to individual voting rights. There's a kind of something in between where there's this change that reductive individualists can talk about that's a different kind of wrong given the scale of the violation of individual rights. So it was really just to say, it was intended to say something like, look, Rodin's mistaken in the way that he's thinking about this implication. But I think we can also combine this with the thought that I just mentioned, that the amount of harm you get to do depends on not just the number of people's rights who are being threatened, but also which rights are being threatened, the kind of wrong that you're threatening to perpetrate against them. And so if it's true that, given that this is a large-scale threat to lots of people's rights, and then now we've changed to a different kind of wrong that's being perpetrated, then again, it looks like you're going to get to use more harm because it's a different a threat to a different sort of right, a more important right. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of maybe all I want to say for now. Is that I'd have to think more about the positive proposal, and obviously I'm probably going to be more sceptical about this sort of collective agency stuff than perhaps you are. But I thought a lot of what you said sounded really interesting. I'm just not sure that we've shown yet that the aggregative strategy can't do the work that I'm suggesting it can do.
Can I just say something?
No.
So, Massimo, quickly respond, and then this is
Wow.
okay. I'm legitimately putting myself on this.
So-
everyone keep your hands up.
I wasn't sure about, so you don't think that one of your goals is to show why we can wage war of national defense to begin with? Because I took it that to be the main challenge that David was raising. You don't even get to start the war because the interests protected that you will be protecting are not sufficiently important. They are these trivial political interests. You seem to be saying that your main goal was to justify how much, to say something about how much lethal force could be used in war. But I thought that the counterintuitive implication that David was pointing at for reductivist individualists was that those wars of national defense in defense of purely political goals cannot even be fought.
No, sorry, I think there's a confusion here. So I think you can aggregate against these lesser interests, but I also think it's true that when we get to a certain scale, it's a different kind of wrong that's being perpetrated, which which I think is going to be relevant. But I do think that this is a way of justifying national defence. And I did also just have another, I forgot, I wanted to say, I wasn't quite following, when you said that it looks like now I've kind of changed the game because I'm supposed to be showing that it's permissible to defend purely political interests, and then you say, look, now once I start talking about these things being backed by threats of force and so on, you say, oh, well, now you're not talking about political goods. That's wrong. I don't think that's right, because those are still just conditional threats to what you seem to think are non-political interests. And the thought is, well, can I permissibly resist direct threats to purely political interests, foreseeing that this will cause these direct threats to non-political interests? And that's still true in this case, right? So these are changes that the aggressor wants to impose that are backed by threats of lethal force, but they're still conditional threats. So I don't think I'm changing the sort of the target in the way that you suggest.
Well, maybe talk about this later.
Okay, so here's my, I forgot to put myself in there. Okay, I'll put myself at the bottom. So I've got a list of Jeremy, Kai, Ed, Mike, Adel, Jeff, Simon, Victor, Cheney, Yitzhak, me, and one man and his dog.
Okay.
Who hasn't asked a question? Who hasn't raised his hand? Shame on you.
Everyone went to Mohamedo. So, you know, we're never
That's
going
my
to get
water,
through.
you can have some of it.
I'll try and hurry you along a bit, but we probably won't get through everybody. Jeremy, please start us off.
Thanks for that. So I just got a quick question. I think it's just a clarification on the particular account of political self-determination you're working with. So it looks like this is going to be something that some collectives instantiate and others will fail to for all sorts of reasons. And in those kinds of, or maybe they've lost that or something. So it looks like when that happens, it's going to be difficult to explain the particular sort of wrong that's going on when the state is, or this collective that no longer instantiates this right, when they're sort of bloodlessly invaded. And I think actually this is where Helen's account can accommodate that still, because you can still aggregate those lower interests. And so I'm curious if your particular account of political self-determination, if it goes that way, if you think that this is going to be a problem with that, or if there's a different sort of way of understanding it that might fit around that problem.
So you're talking about a case in which there's no self-determining political community, but there's just a bunch of individuals living there.
Or maybe this particular collective has somehow lost that right for, maybe they've, I don't know, it depends on the account, I guess, but if you have an account where they're no longer sort of permitted to exercise this political self-determination because they've done horrible things or something, or maybe there's just a weaker level of agency going on there, maybe.
Right. So, I mean, what I want to say is that if there is no genuine self-determining community, that this argument doesn't go through. I'm not saying that this is the only argument. There might be other ways of explaining why, for example, having control over a certain territory or protecting certain values might justify resorting to lethal violence. I'm just saying here's an argument that works by appealing to self-determination.
So I think we're not going to do fingers, and I'm going to limit follow-ups just to help get towards the bottom of the queue. Kai, isn't it?
Yeah, I just had a question also for clarification. So when you're talking about individual self-determination, you said that the value of that is like intrinsic, it's part of the well-being, individual well-being to be self-determined. Then you move to political self-determination. And I'm having a hard time seeing what the value of that is. It doesn't seem, because the group can have a well-being that could be harmed by lacking the group self-determination. So I think at that level it won't be instrumental in the way it affects individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I don't see any reason why I should care about whether I'm taking part in, group behavior in that way. But
Right.
so just to clarify,
Right.
is it just instrumental in that way for something for individuals?
Yeah, so I think the account is individualist, as I said. I didn't stress that again at the end, but I mentioned this at the beginning. This is meant to be a reductivist and an individualist account, which I think you might be more sympathetic to it than you think at first. Because I think there's no well-being of the group that is out there. There's just an interest of a bunch of people in making these decisions together. The fact that some people don't see the value of that's not a counterexample to my view, I believe. So if some people don't see the value of being in a relationship, in having a family. But that doesn't mean that others don't have an interest in making decisions as members of a family. So I think those who don't see the value of being members of a political community, they are those people I discussed toward the end who don't identify themselves or something like that. They retain other interests in not being exposed to harm, and their interests are to be traded off with the interest of other members of the members of the political community to wage a war in defense of the political community.
Sometimes it's nice to know if somebody doesn't see the value of something, if you can explain it to them.
Well, I mean, I think there. Yeah, I don't say much about this here, but I think when I did say something about it. I said that membership in a political community has to do with you identifying with a certain with the way in which a group acts in light of a certain culture, a certain values that they share. So it might be there are a bunch of people who have written about this, who have explained how it can be part of a meaningful life, the fact that you relate to members of a number of communities, and the political community is one of these communities. So Raz and others have written about these. Victor has recently written something about this. But you're right, I don't say much about this here. And
a question for Massimo, and related to the first one, I think. So are the goals of the voting political community relevant to the permissibility of their using lethal defensive force to defend political sovereignty? So say the voting public wants to legislate slavery.
right.
So this gets into the question of humanitarian intervention.
Right. So I don't think that acknowledging the value of exercising self-determining agency means that you can deliberate to do anything you want as an instance of this self-determining agency. So we value personal self-determination, but don't we think you have a right to enslave people? So if we don't think that in the case of individual self-determination, why should we think that in the case of collective self-determination?
Okay. Mike?
Helen, Massimo says correctly that you say there's just one
I like
morality.
that.
And you say
I'm sorry, I missed that.
that there's just one morality.
Right,
Yes. And towards the end of your book, you say that therefore, all service members should make up their own decision about whether the war they're being sent to is just or unjust, make decisions about whether to deploy or not based on it. So it seems to me that in that, since there's just one morality, that credo of individual decisions must apply to all professionals, diplomats, policemen, doctors, lawyers. Now, the received view, by contrast, is that professionals properly see there being a professional ethos applying to them. And a professional ethos is not just a set of norms, but an enculturated feeling that they really have to follow those professional norms. So, for example, doctors and lawyers have a norm of confidentiality towards their clients, for example. Lay people want professionals to have this kind of professional ethos because it leads to the efficient delivery of the characteristic ends of professions. And it also shields lay people, protects them from the power that professionals have, like the power over personal information, and the dangerous skill sets they have. So, I worry that the society-wide cost of all professionals, doctors, lawyers, diplomats, soldiers, winging it, using their own judgment about what to do, rather than deferring to their professional norms, points to the implausibility of reductionism, or at least the unacceptably high costs of reductionism.
Okay, so I mean, I think that there's interesting stuff to say about role-based obligations. So I don't explore that in the book. My view is, I think Jeff has talked about these things and said things which I find quite plausible about the limits of what can be justified. So there are going to be cases in which we can think that there are good reasons that are compatible with an individualist account of why we want to have certain things like client confidentiality, for example. I just think that there are limits to what these roles can justify. So they don't justify the infliction of unjust harm. And so that's why I think soldiers need to think in sort of moral terms that that anybody thinking about causing harm should think, right? We should think about just cause, necessity, proportionality, and so on. And the claim, so the reductivist claim is just that there's a single set of principles that governs the use of force. So that's the kind of the key one good way of understanding the reductivist view, and does so in all contexts. And the claim that I think I make at the end of the book is that this means that when soldiers are thinking about whether or not to go to war, then they should think about the same questions that individuals should think about when they're using individual defensive force. I do think there's interesting thoughts about, role obligations and things like that, but I just don't explore those questions in the book.
Okay, other.
So one way, do either of you think that there's a difference between a self-determining community that is now facing aggression and the loss of their self-determining capability, and a community in which they've never had self-determination, but now they really want to have a revolution to establish self-determination over the tyranny under which they live? Massimo, it sometimes sounded like you think that there is a difference, and the first is more plausible than the second. I wasn't sure. Helen, if you think that it really is about aggregation of individual interests, maybe you think these are much more analogous. Ultimately, what we just care about is each individual's interest in being able to exercise some influence on it. So there wouldn't be a difference. I have something else for the question.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there could be some differences in terms of things like who's going to suffer the collateral harm. So if it's a revolution that's taking place within the state, then the people who are going to suffer collateral harms are also, we would think, going to be beneficiaries of the action, and that could make a difference. But otherwise, I think that a lot of the considerations would be the same.
Right, so I think that if we value self-determination, that gives us reason not only to respect self-determining political communities, but also to promote self-determining communities. And so getting an aspiring would-be political community to achieve the status of a self-determining political community might be important. It just seems to me that there are some moral differences between these two cases, and we should acknowledge those differences.
Do you think about it for the use of lethal force?
It is true that in one case, we would have to think what it is to be what the rights of aspiring self-determining political community are. It might be that they will end up being extensionally equivalent with those of a already self-determining political community, but conceptually they seem different to me.
I have doubts about the claims you made, Massimo, about proportionality and individual self-defense.
Okay.
And to the extent that the account as a whole depends on these, I worry about the whole account. You made two claims. First of all, that it can be proportionate for one individual to use lethal, opportunistic force against the wrongdoer to prevent a sufficiently grave interference with personal self-determination. And then you also said, and you went over this very quickly without discussing it, that an individual, it can be proportionate for an individual to use lethal but non-opportunistic force against an innocent bystander or innocent bystanders or whatever, in order to prevent a wrongdoer, or the side effect of preventing a wrongdoer from interfering with the individual's self-determination. I have a number of doubts about those claims. One is that your first claim about what it's permissible, what it's proportionate to do to wrongdoers in individual self-defense to prevent violations of individual self-determination is most plausible if we presuppose that the wrongdoers are highly culpable for their interference with self-determination. But as we know, many unjust combatants, particularly in cases of lesser aggression or political aggression or whatever, who think perhaps they may not have to kill many people or whatever, may not be highly culpable. And so that raises the question whether it really could be permissible to kill, I mean, even for an individual to kill, let's say, a minimally responsible person who threatens their self-determination, even in some important way.
Right.
I think it's not permissible to kill an innocent bystander as a side effect of defending one individual's life.
Right.
I can't imagine that it could be permissible to kill an innocent bystander as a side effect of protecting the individual's self-determination.
Right.
And, 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 I can't imagine that it could be permissible both to kill a minimally responsible threatener and an innocent bystander as a side effect of protecting an individual's self-determination. And I also thought that the focus on self-determination exclusively may be mistaken in that it seems to me, personally, as my own view, it's much less bad for somebody to intervene in somebody's self-determination if the effect of the intervention is actually better for the person, or not worse, or not much worse. So a lot of the focus in my thinking about lesser aggression has been on the effects on people's well-being in their lives and so on, because often interferences with self-determination don't really have that big effect on well-being. Right. So if you put all these things together, could it really be permissible to kill a lot of minimally responsible wrongdoers, kill a lot of innocent bystanders in order to prevent interference with collective self-determination when the outcome really wouldn't be much worse for any of the people? It seems to me highly implausible. Right, good. So it seems to me, so I'll try to take, to respond very quickly to the 3 points. So one is, what if it's a minimally responsible threat to your capacity to act as a self-determining agent? What seems to me that if the setback to my capacity to act as a self-determining agent is serious enough, I might be able to use lethal force against a minimally responsible threat, just like I would be allowed to use lethal force against a minimally responsible threat against my life. So if you prevent me from spending the rest of my life with my partner, or if you get me to, again, to live a life that I despise, it seems to me that I'm permitted to use lethal force, even if you're only a minimally responsible threat. Of course, if you're going to do that to everybody in a political community as individuals, then the aggression is really no longer lesser aggression. You can separate everybody from their families and, Right, but suppose, yeah. But suppose that, and this speaks to your second point, because it seems to me that we might imagine a case. It depends on how you see the relationship between living an autonomous life and well-being. So I think that living an autonomous life is a component of well-being. So you seem to think that if you get me to spend the rest of my life with a partner that I haven't chosen, and in fact I'm as happy with that partner or even more happy with the party that I would have been with my own partner, then that is not a serious interference with my well-being. But it seems to me that's mistaken. It seems to me that I have a strong interest in spending the rest of my life with the person I've chosen, or doing engaging in the sort of valuable activities I've chosen for myself, even if I'll be less happy than I would have been if I had chosen different activities. There was a third point, but I don't remember what it was. Innocent bystander's point. The bystander's point. So I agree. If we believe that it's not permissible to kill the bystander in order to defend your life, I agree that it's not also permissible to kill the bystander in order to defend your capacity to act as a self-determining agency. So that's a disagreement in the background.
But isn't that a big problem? Because what you're really looking to justify in war is going to be the collateral harm to the bystanders. It's not really so much about the combatants, it's the collateral harms to
I didn't say I agree with Jeff. I say that the disagreement is not about the value of political self-determination. The disagreement is whether you can kill. That argument then shifts and then is about whether you can kill bystanders in order to protect a valuable interest such as your life or self-determination. There's nothing distinctive about self-determination that prevents me from saying that.
So we have 10 minutes left, and let's say 4 questioners. So, Simon.
I'll just be very quick, because there's a whole set of issues that, from an international law perspective, need to be unpacked. One issue is how you look at this in the context of threats to rights. Because international law provides for certainly up to and including lethal force to be used where there's a threat to international peace and security. It doesn't even have to manifest itself, very often does. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your particular perspective in relation to the threat of the loss of a certain right, rather than that loss having manifested itself by virtue of physical, if bloodless invasion. The second issue is, and you talked a little bit in your first remarks, Helen, I think, about the difference between the resort of force and the use of force. But I've heard neither of you say anything about the cessation of force. And I think you need to have an account that indicates when you're going to stop using force in the context of these examples. Now you could say, well, that's by virtue of the restoration of these rights that have been violated. But I've yet to hear how you account for that. And
No further questions?
and then just finally about
I think two will do you, Simon. Okay, so
Alright.
can I answer those?
So on that second thought about when we stop using force, I mean, I take it that Massimo and I are thinking about when it's permissible to use force, and we're thinking the answer is, well, when certain conditions are satisfied, and then you stop using force when those conditions are no longer satisfied. So this could be that you no longer have a just cause because you've secured it, right? So you've prevented the threat to the rights. Or it could be that your wars become disproportionate, so it turns out you're going to have to do a lot more damage than you thought, and now you don't have any prospect of securing the just cause without doing disproportionate harm. So that's when you should stop using force, but it's just this single set of principles that determines when you can use force, and that's just the flip side to when you can use force is when you satisfy the principles. When the principles are not satisfied, then you should stop using force. So it's really the sort of two sides of the same coin. Do you want to do the threat one?
Well, so again, I don't think there is anything, nothing I says here speaks to the question whether it is ever permissible to wage a war in order to preserve international peace and security. This is not supposed to provide an exhaustive account of all the cases in which you can wage a defensive war.
I mean, the threat question is just I mean, that's a good question about preemption, I think, basically, right? So that's the issue is, at what point does it become permissible to use force? Most people don't think you have to wait until you've actually been attacked and people have been killed. But then there's just sort of standard questions about the prevention, preemption distinction, and at what point something becomes a threat that you can permissibly try to avert. But we're not really talking about that question.
Okay, so there's you and I are gonna step off. Take two last questions together from Cheney and Victor.
I guess I'm more worried about hands-off imperialism, Massimo, and I'm trying to think of how to put it. It seems to me that there's an issue of something like honor, but community honor in these situations that is not fully captured by what you're saying. You know, when you look at these, when the British Empire was going around, occupying places in the 19th century, oftentimes what they wanted was really quite trivial. Oftentimes they wanted like commercial rights or something, which in fact didn't impact very many people. But you had this massive reaction against it eventually, because in some sense what people were saying is, we don't want self-determination, we want to be recognized as a community equal to other communities. And in some sense, how substantial the violation is not really that important, it's the message being conveyed. So I think that discussion, the great discussion yesterday about honor and expressive dimension, I mean, certainly I think that's what someone would respond to you about this. And first of all, I don't know exactly what you would say about it. But clearly, when you look at these movements of national self-determination, that strikes me as an absolutely vital force.
Right. And Victor?
I don't think you should be a reductive individualist about this. I think that an autonomously realised just society has a great deal of impersonal value. Whether it could make a difference in war, I'm not quite so sure, but I think it does have a great deal of impersonal value. So you should at least acknowledge that it does and then work out whether it makes a difference. And in your voting cases, it looks like you saddle people in the Labour Party who vote against tax breaks for hedge fund managers with the idea that they did it together. And we gave the tax breaks. And if I was a Labour politician, I'd say, fuck off. It had nothing to do with me, and I'm not having it.
It's always nice for the last question to finish with fuck off.
Yeah.
Your response could finish with
Yeah, do I have to? Okay, I'll think of something.
I think just gestures is okay.
Yeah, we're on camera, so that'll work out nicely. Okay, so in reply to Cheney, so I think you're absolutely right. I mean, honor is an important consideration. I didn't want to say that you, in cases of hands-off imperialism, don't fail to respect the moral status of the members of the political community. Just like when I am, when I exercise this sort of dominion over, when you exercise a sort of dominion over my family by being ready to steal our savings so that we can't send our child to a private school, you are failing to respect us as moral equal, as autonomous moral agents. But you are not, what is not true, I think, is that what we do fails to count as a genuine exercise of our self-determination. And insofar as the argument I offer here grounds in this idea, the permissibility of waging defensive force, then it won't justify using defensive force in order to defend, to prevent hands-off imperialism. There might be, someone could come up with a good argument that shows that defending honor is a sufficiently good reason to justify killing others, and I wouldn't object necessarily to that. I mean, I don't know, maybe I would, but nothing I say here commits me to saying that. So on impersonal value, yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that, I don't think I said that it has no impersonal value. I just wanted the challenge here to resist, because of course, if you appeal to impersonal value, then you give up reductionism and individualism, and the Rodin's challenge is not met. And I think there's something particularly interesting in showing how you can do this on reductivist individualist grounds. I'm open to the possibility, so Seth says something about this, I'm open to the possibilities there might be impersonal value in the realization of these goals. Yeah, on your last point, I think that I think that it's not clear. It's not clear in that case that you are thinking about the relation. I mean, it's not clear that the members of the Labour Party, as you describe them, would be taking part in a genuine exercise of collective self-determination. I was talking with Kim about this yesterday. There might be cases in which you have good reason to pretend you are doing that. And those are cases in which you act in the way in which you would if you were a member of the self-determining political community, but you are not ready to take responsibility for how the community acts. I think that's just not how collective agency works. All the worse for it, you might think, yeah.
You don't want to
Fuck up.
All right, let's thank these guys for a great session. Before everyone stands up, so first of all, lunch is downstairs. Second of all, so those who are speakers who are down for going to the dinner tonight, are any speakers not going to be coming to dinner? Are you planning on going? Okay, so you two are coming. The reservation that we have at does have space for more people. It'll be pay your own way if you want to come. But does anybody else want to come to dinner tonight who hasn't already? Mike, okay?
How expensive is it?
Sorry?
How expensive is it?
I mean, it's not. How expensive is Mount Fuku? Yeah, I think it's pretty. It's like $70-80, I think, for the food. Which time is it? 7:30.
Where is it?
So Mama Fuku Mapesh, 7:30.
Oh, yeah.
It's nearby.
So are we going to a bar from here and then
We'll
to
go.
dinner?
Yeah, we'll go to a bar from here to dinner. So, okay, so.
Is that paid for too by the Carnegie Council?
The bar, yeah.
Carnegie Council.
Open tab all night, Cheney.
Carnegie Council.
Invite everybody and just send me the bill.
No, Carnegie Council is not paying for anything. Me and Helen are paying for it. So Mike, nobody else for dinner? Yep. Okay, so 2 more for dinner and two.
Hey Seth, what time is the dinner?
7:30. Okay, so 2 more. All right, so now lunch is
At the beginning, I didn't understand your claim against Helen's argument about aggregation.
Uh-huh.
And then the following analogy came up.
Uh-huh.
If capital punishment is disproportionate for one theft, it cannot be proportionate